Daniel's mother says she still hears the sound. Boots crushing leaves in the dark, flashlights cutting through trees, voices calling her son's name over and over and over again. And one voice, calm, steady, determined, leading the search. "Daniel, we're coming, buddy!" She trusted that voice. She thanked that voice. She hugged that voice. She had no idea that the man shouting her son's name into the woods was the same man who had buried him there. This is the story of how a killer hid in plain sight, how he joined the search party, and how the smallest piece of evidence exposed him. October 14th. Ridgeway was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened. Tree-lined streets, porch lights left on overnight, neighbors who waved even if they didn't know your name. At 7:12 p.m., 16-year-old Daniel Harper stepped out of his house wearing a gray hoodie and running shoes. He told his mom he'd be back in an hour. He was meeting someone near Mill Creek Park. He didn't say who, but he didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem afraid. At 8:03 p.m., his mother sent a text. "Everything okay?" No reply. At 9:17 p.m., she called. It rang, then went to voicemail. By 10:30 p.m., she was standing on her front porch, staring down the street, heart pounding in her ears. Daniel wasn't the type to disappear. No history of running away, no trouble at school, no secret double life. Just a normal teenager. At 11:02 p.m., she dialed 911. Officers arrived within minutes. They took a report, checked nearby streets, drove through the park entrance. Nothing. By sunrise, Ridgeway woke up to sirens and worry. Flyers were printed before noon. Search volunteers gathered by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Church groups, high school students, construction workers, parents. Everyone showed up, including a man named Eric Lawson, 34 years old, lived 2 streets away from the Harper family. He wasn't close to Daniel, but he arrived early, before some of Daniel's own classmates. He carried a case of bottled water and extra flashlights in the back of his truck. He helped organize volunteers into grid lines. He offered to search the deeper wooded areas, the thick parts near the creek where the trees swallowed light whole. He looked focused, determined, invested. When Daniel's mother broke down near the tree line, Eric stepped forward and put a steady hand on her shoulder. "We're going to find him," he said softly. She believed him. That first night, searchers combed through the woods until nearly 2 a.m. Flashlights moved like fireflies in the darkness. Voices echoed Daniel's name across the water. Eric's voice was always the loudest. He shouted into the trees. He pushed through brush. He stayed longer than most. And when volunteers finally began drifting home, exhausted and discouraged, Eric stayed behind. He told others he wanted to check one more section near the creek bend, alone. The next morning, he was back again.
Early, before sunrise, coffee in hand, ready to search. What no one knew, what no one could see, was that Eric had already been in those woods the night Daniel disappeared. Not searching, not calling his name, but digging. By day 3, the tension in Ridgeway felt suffocating. News crews began arriving. Speculation spread online. Then a volunteer discovered something. Daniel's backpack. It was partially hidden under fallen leaves near a shallow ravine. Inside were his school notebooks, a cracked cell phone, a water bottle. The phone looked damaged, but not destroyed. Detectives carefully sealed it in an evidence bag. Eric stood nearby when they found it. He ran both hands over his head in disbelief. "Oh my God," he muttered. He looked shaken, distraught, concerned. He even helped clear space so investigators could work. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was just a neighbor trying to help. That night, Eric returned home and showered longer than usual.
He washed his hands twice. Then he sat at his kitchen table in the dark, waiting. Because he knew something the rest of the town didn't. He knew Daniel wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't hiding. Daniel was exactly where Eric had left him, beneath a thin layer of disturbed earth, in the same woods where hundreds of people were now searching. And every time Eric walked past that patch of ground, every time he shouted Daniel's name, every time he comforted the family, he believed he was in control. But somewhere inside that cracked phone found in the leaves was a digital breadcrumb, a timestamp, a silent witness, and it was about to change everything. The morning after the backpack was found, the town of Ridgeway felt heavier. A sense of dread hung in the crisp autumn air. Families whispered in their kitchens. Kids avoided the park entirely. Everyone was talking about Daniel and wondering who could have done this. Eric Lawson arrived early at the search site again, just like he had every day. But now there was something different in his demeanor, a mix of anxiety and calculated calm. He carried a fresh batch of water bottles, a new first aid kit, and extra gloves. He offered to lead one of the search teams. Volunteers hesitated at first. They didn't know him well. But his confident tone and practical suggestions made it easy to trust him. "Let's start from the creek bend and work back toward the North Trail," he instructed. He handed out maps he'd photocopied himself. He drew grid lines, explaining how to sweep the area efficiently. Daniel's mother watched from a distance. Every time Eric approached, he smiled gently, crouched beside her, and offered words of comfort. "We're going to find him, I promise," he said. It was the same phrase he repeated to other volunteers. It sounded genuine. But the detectives were already noticing inconsistencies. Eric claimed he had no knowledge of the woods beyond what anyone could see from the park entrance, yet the areas he was leading the teams into were oddly precise, places that hadn't been thoroughly checked before, spots where no volunteers had thought to look. By mid-morning, volunteers began reporting small findings: a torn shoelace snagged on a branch, footprints half buried in soft dirt, a crumpled water bottle. All seemingly innocent, all within areas Eric had suggested searching. Every time something was found, Eric would approach, inspect, and make notes in a small leather notebook. He'd scribble the findings, nod solemnly, and move on. No one questioned why he was always one step ahead. During one particularly tense moment, Daniel's father stood at the edge of the creek, scanning the water. "I can't believe how deep this search has gone," he said, his voice shaking. Eric stepped beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've covered a lot of ground, but we can't stop now," Eric said softly. It was comforting. It was manipulative. Because while the volunteers were calling Daniel's name through the misty woods, Eric was mentally retracing every step he had taken the night Daniel disappeared, the route he had chosen for Daniel, the spot he had selected to bury him, the layers of soil he had disturbed. He was observing the searchers as much as they were observing the woods, and with every suggestion he made, every word of encouragement he whispered, he was controlling the flow of the investigation. No one suspected him. Not yet.
But there were traces, tiny, almost invisible, that would eventually betray him. That evening, as the volunteers began to leave, Eric stayed behind, alone. He carried a flashlight and a clipboard. He walked past the creek bend where Daniel's backpack had been found. He crouched by the leaves, pretending to inspect the ground, but his eyes scanned for anything that could be linked to him: shovel marks, disturbed soil, evidence he might have left behind. When he finally returned home, he washed his boots carefully, removed traces of dirt, and scrubbed his gloves. Every surface he touched in the search, every flashlight, every map, he cleaned meticulously. He had to. One mistake could ruin everything.
That night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a photograph of the woods on his laptop. He circled paths with a red pen, plotting the exact locations Daniel had been. Every plan he had executed, every lie he had told, had to be flawless, because the smallest mistake, the tiniest piece of evidence, could be the one thing that finally exposed him. By day 3, exhaustion had settled over Ridgeway like a heavy fog. Volunteers were tired, anxious, and frustrated. Every hour felt like a lifetime, and hope was starting to slip away. Then it happened. Near the edge of a shallow ravine, partially hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves, a volunteer spotted something unusual. A backpack. It was Daniel's. The volunteers froze. Whispered cries ran through the group. Daniel's mother arrived within minutes, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel's father could barely stand. The news spread like wildfire. Daniel had left a trace, something tangible, something that meant he had been here. Eric Lawson was among the first to reach the scene. "Oh my God," he muttered, his voice shaky. "We found him. We found him." He bent down, lifted the backpack carefully, and handed it to the volunteers to secure. Every move he made seemed deliberate, careful, concerned, observant. Inside, the backpack contained school notebooks, slightly damp from the morning dew, a cracked smartphone, a water bottle, half empty. The smartphone looked damaged, but forensic teams immediately recognized its potential. They could extract data, they could trace calls and messages, and that digital breadcrumb would soon change everything. While the backpack was carefully bagged and transported for analysis, Eric stood nearby, wiping his brow, taking deep breaths. He whispered to Daniel's mother, "We'll find him. We're getting closer. I promise." And she believed him. The detectives began reconstructing Daniel's last hours. They traced his steps from home to the park using witness statements and phone pings. Daniel's last outgoing message was sent to an unknown number at 7:26 p.m. The number belonged to a prepaid phone bought 2 weeks prior at a convenience store in Ridgeway. The footage from the store showed a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, paying in cash. Blurry, yes, but investigators would later determine it was Eric. The detectives dug deeper. Cell tower data placed another device at the exact location Daniel disappeared, a phone registered to Eric Lawson. When questioned, Eric claimed he had been home watching television, alone, but the phone didn't lie. He had been near the woods, in the exact area Daniel vanished. Every lie, every carefully crafted moment of empathy was beginning to unravel. That night, Eric returned home. He washed his hands obsessively, cleaned his shoes, and sat staring into the dark, tracing the backpack's location in his mind. For him, this was just the beginning. For Ridgeway, it was the first glimpse that the truth might be closer than anyone realized, and that the man they had trusted most in their darkest hour could be the very person who had caused it. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was undeniable. Eric Lawson had lied. Every comforting word, every gesture of concern, every suggestion to volunteers had been part of a plan to manipulate the search, to stay close to the investigation, to control the chaos he created. The man who had cried with the family, the man who shouted Daniel's name into the darkness, the man who led volunteers with purpose and compassion, was the man who had buried him. And in that moment, the horrifying reality became clear. He wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He had been orchestrating the search all along, believing himself untouchable. But evidence doesn't lie, and every small trace, every fleck of paint, every footprint, every DNA fragment would soon unravel his carefully constructed facade. With Daniel's body discovered, Ridgeway plunged into grief, confusion, and disbelief. How could someone so trusted, so seemingly kind, have done this? How could the person leading the search be the one who caused it? Detectives knew they had to reconstruct the timeline meticulously. Every call, every movement, every minute mattered. 7:12 p.m. Daniel left his home, hoodie zipped tight, backpack slung over his shoulder. 7:24 p.m. His phone pinged near Mill Creek Park. 7:26 p.m. The last outgoing text, "Here, where are you?" went to an unknown number. 7:31 p.m. Phone signal dropped abruptly. The detectives noticed something disturbing, a second device in the exact area at the exact same time, a phone registered to Eric Lawson. When questioned, Eric repeated the same story. He was home watching TV, alone. But cell tower data didn't lie. He had been in the woods, near the creek bend, precisely when Daniel disappeared. Investigators cross-referenced volunteer reports. Eric had been suggesting search areas, leading groups directly over and around the spot Daniel had been buried. Every lie he told was unraveling. Every gesture of sympathy now looked calculated. Detectives dug deeper. They reviewed security footage from a local convenience store where the prepaid phone had been purchased. A man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, cash in hand, purchased the phone exactly 2 weeks prior to Daniel's disappearance. The footage was blurry, but the posture, height, and gait were telling. Eric had planned this meticulously. He had studied the area. He had purchased a disposable phone to coordinate his crime, and he had embedded himself in the search to manipulate both the family and the investigators. Forensic analysis continued. Microscopic flecks of blue epoxy paint on Daniel's hoodie matched a rare batch from Eric's workplace. Blood traces on the shovel in Eric's truck tied him directly to the crime scene. Even deleted internet searches from Eric's home computer painted a chilling picture. How long before body smell appears outdoors? How to track cell phone without a SIM card? Best ways to conceal evidence in the woods. Everything pointed to premeditation. Every action during the search was deliberate. Every comforting word, every organizational suggestion, every moment of concern, it was all part of maintaining control, staying close, and manipulating the investigation. Detectives reconstructed the entire night. Eric lured Daniel under the pretense of a small job. He attacked. He buried the body. Then, as the town panicked, he stepped in as a concerned neighbor, leading searches, shaping the investigation, and maintaining the facade of innocence. But no matter how clever he thought he was, the forensic evidence and digital breadcrumbs were closing in. The smallest details, the paint flecks, the phone pings, the shovel, were unraveling his lie. The man who had shouted Daniel's name into the forest was now the prime suspect in the murder investigation. And Ridgeway was only beginning to realize that sometimes the most trusted people are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. By day 7, detectives had pieced together enough evidence to confront Eric Lawson directly. The town of Ridgeway had been living in a haze of grief, fear, and disbelief. Volunteers were exhausted, but the real investigation had just reached a critical turning point. When Eric arrived at the police station for a routine follow-up interview, he appeared calm, too calm. Hands folded on the table, eyes steady, a faint smile as if nothing could touch him. Detectives began with routine questions. "Where were you on the night of October 14th? "I told you I was home watching TV, Eric replied. "Can anyone confirm that?" He hesitated. I live alone. No one can." Then came the cell tower data. The phone registered to him had been in the woods at the exact time Daniel disappeared. Eric blinked, paused. He leaned back in his chair. "Must have gone out for a drive. I clear my head sometimes," he muttered, voice tight. Detectives pressed harder. They laid out every detail they had uncovered. The security footage of the prepaid phone purchase, the backpack discovery and its location, the precise search areas Eric had led volunteers through. For the first time, Eric's composed facade began to crack. Next came the forensic breakthroughs. Tiny flecks of blue industrial epoxy paint on Daniel's hoodie matched the rare coating used exclusively at Eric's workplace. Blood traces on the shovel in his truck tied him directly to the crime scene. Detectives showed Eric the lab results. They displayed the microscopic paint flecks under a forensic microscope, highlighting the match. They presented the soil samples from the shovel, the traces of Daniel's blood, and the chemical analysis. Eric's hands shook. His gaze fell to the table. I don't know what to say," he whispered. Then the digital evidence. Deleted searches on his computer revealed planning for the crime. How long before body smell appears outdoors. Cell phone tracking without SIM card. How to hide a body in the woods. Every lie, every manipulative gesture, every step he had taken to insert himself into the search party, it was collapsing. The detectives pressed on, calmly but relentlessly. "Eric, the evidence is overwhelming. Do you want to tell us what happened?" Silence. The room was heavy with tension. Eric's mask of empathy, the comforting neighbor, the helpful search leader, was gone. All that remained was a man cornered by his own arrogance, exposed by the smallest details he thought he could control.
Finally, he asked for a lawyer, but the evidence spoke louder than any confession could. The investigators had built a timeline and a case so airtight, so precise, that it left no room for doubt. Eric Lawson had hidden in plain sight for days. He had comforted the family he betrayed. He had led the search he sabotaged. But forensic science, digital traces, and microscopic evidence had trapped him. In that moment, the authorities realized the killer isn't always the one running or hiding. Sometimes he is standing beside you, shining a flashlight, guiding you to the very place he hopes you will never see. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, Eric's collapse had only just begun. The trial of Eric Lawson began 3 months after Daniel Harper's body was found. Ridgeway had changed. The town was quieter, heavier, filled with whispered conversations about betrayal, trust, and horror. The courtroom was packed. Families, neighbors, and volunteers who had once followed Eric through the woods now sat in disbelief, staring at the man who had manipulated them. Daniel's parents were at the front row, clutching each other's hands, faces etched with grief. Prosecutors opened with a chilling statement. Eric Lawson did not merely commit a crime, he orchestrated deception. He inserted himself into the heart of the search he had sabotaged, and he thought he could escape justice. But the evidence tells a different story. The courtroom fell silent. The case against Eric was overwhelming. Digital evidence showed premeditation, the prepaid phone, internet searches on concealing a body, and tracking cell signals. Forensic evidence tied him directly to the crime. Paint flecks on Daniel's hoodie, blood traces on the shovel, soil samples from the burial site. Witness testimony detailed his suspicious behavior during the search, his uncanny knowledge of areas no volunteer had explored. Yet the darkest revelations came from inside his home. Investigators uncovered notes, drawings, and maps that detailed not just Daniel's disappearance, but also previous minor crimes Eric had committed, ranging from theft to stalking neighbors.
The prosecution described Eric as meticulous, manipulative, and narcissistic. Every comforting gesture, every helpful suggestion during the search party, every expression of empathy had been calculated to maintain control and avoid suspicion. As witnesses recounted the events, the courtroom felt suffocating. One by one, volunteers described how Eric had led them past areas where Daniel's body would later be found, how he had comforted the family, how he had spoken with such authority that no one doubted him. When Daniel's mother took the stand, she spoke softly, tears streaming down her face. "He was supposed to help us find our son. I hugged him, I thanked him, I trusted him, and he had taken my boy from me." The words hung in the room like a stone. Eric remained stoic for much of the trial, though occasional slips betrayed him, a quiver in his lip, a twitch of his hand, an unsteady gaze when forensic photos were shown. The defense tried to paint him as a concerned neighbor, an innocent volunteer caught in a nightmare, but the evidence, precise and undeniable, refused to support that narrative. The blue paint flakes, the shovel, the phone records, the cell tower data, and the internet searches created a web of proof that left no room for doubt. By the end of the trial, the jury had seen the full picture. A man who meticulously planned a crime, executed it, and then inserted himself into the investigation to maintain control over the chaos he had created. The courtroom remained tense as the closing statements were made. The prosecutor's final words cut through the room like a knife. Eric Lawson believed he could manipulate everyone, even the law, but he underestimated the truth. Evidence does not lie, science does not forget, and justice will not be denied. As Eric's face remained impassive, Daniel's parents sat in silence, grief-stricken but resolute. And Ridgeway began to understand the chilling reality. The most dangerous person in a search party isn't always the one looking for someone. Sometimes it's the one hiding in plain sight, smiling, comforting, leading, and watching. For 10 days, Eric Lawson shouted Daniel's name into the woods. He guided volunteers, comforted the family, and led the search. He played the hero while hiding the darkest secret. But evidence doesn't lie, it doesn't forget, and it does not forgive. A tiny fleck of paint, a single cell phone ping, a trace of blood. These were all it took to expose the man who believed he could control everything and everyone around him. Predators can hide anywhere, even in plain sight. But justice, patience, and the smallest details always have a way of finding the truth. Daniel Harper didn't get to walk home that night, but in the end, the evidence walked him to justice. Remember this, the most dangerous person in your search may be standing right beside you. Subscribe to Murder Book 360 to uncover more stories of deception, hidden darkness, and the relentless pursuit of truth.